Part 1, The New Beginning expanded. Sarah had always dreamed of living in a big house. When her family found a large, old house on the edge of town, they knew it was perfect for them. The house was affordable and had plenty of space. Her parents were excited, and Sarah, even though she felt a little nervous, couldn't wait to start this new chapter of their lives. The house was huge, with tall windows and a big, creaky wooden door. The walls had faded paint, and the floorboards looked like they had been walked on by generations before them. Still, Sarah thought it had charm. She imagined how lovely it would look once they settled in. Her parents were busy unpacking boxes, while Sarah explored the house. Upstairs, the rooms were filled with old furniture. Some of it looked antique, like it had been there for years, but there was also a sense of emptiness in the air. As Sarah moved from room to room, she noticed that the house had a strange, almost eerie silence. It was the kind of silence that made her feel like she was being watched, even though she was alone. She pushed those thoughts away, reminding herself that it was just an old house, and old houses made strange sounds. The first night they spent in the house, Sarah lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The house was so quiet, too quiet. She could hear the wind howling outside, but that wasn't what bothered her. What bothered her was the creaking sound she kept hearing. It came from upstairs, like someone was walking around. Sarah tried to convince herself it was just the house settling, but the sound seemed too clear, too purposeful. She listened closely, hoping it would stop, but it didn't. It went on for what felt like hours. She pulled the blanket tighter around her, her heart beating faster. Every time she thought it had stopped, the creaking would start again, from a different part of the house. Sarah felt uneasy, but she didn't say anything to her parents. She didn't want to seem scared. They were already so excited about the new house, and she didn't want to spoil the moment. The next day, Sarah told herself she had imagined the noises. After all, it was an old house, and old houses made strange sounds, right? But as the sun set and the house grew quiet again, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She tried to ignore it, but deep down, she knew that the house had secrets it hadn't shared yet. Part 2, Strange Noises expanded. The days passed, and Sarah's family started to settle into their new home. Her parents were busy fixing up the house, painting walls and making repairs, while Sarah and her younger brother, Tom, played in the big backyard. Despite the excitement of their new life, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with the house. It wasn't just the strange creaking noises she had heard on the first night. As days turned into weeks, the sounds became even more frequent, and they started to get stranger. It began with the whispering. At first, Sarah thought it was just the wind blowing through the cracks in the windows, but the whispers were too clear. It sounded like people were talking in hushed voices, though no one was around. Sometimes, she would hear them while she was sitting in the living room, reading a book, or when she was walking down the hallway to the kitchen. She'd stop, listen closely, but find that no one was there. One evening, after dinner, Sarah was sitting alone in the living room, staring at the fireplace. Tom was playing with his toys, and her parents were in the kitchen. She heard it again, the whispers, low and soft. It sounded like two people talking, but their words were too quiet for Sarah to make out. The sound seemed to be coming from upstairs, like someone was standing at the top of the stairs, whispering to each other. She decided to check it out. Climbing the stairs slowly, she called out, "Hello, Mom, Dad," but no one responded. The house was silent now, except for the occasional sound of the wind rustling outside. Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine, but she forced herself to keep moving. She checked all the rooms upstairs, but they were all empty. As Sarah was about to turn back, she heard the whispers again, much closer this time. They were coming from behind her. Her heart pounded in her chest as she quickly spun around, but there was nothing there. The air felt cold, and she shivered. She wasn't sure what she had heard, but she was certain something wasn't right. She rushed back downstairs, her footsteps echoing through the quiet house. That night, Sarah tried to tell her parents about the whispers, but they dismissed it as her imagination. Old houses make strange sounds, honey, her mom said kindly, trying to comfort her. But Sarah wasn't convinced. The whispers weren't just sounds, they felt real, like someone was watching her. And she didn't know who or what it was. The house, once exciting and new, was starting to feel like a place full of secrets that Sarah wasn't sure she wanted to uncover. Part 3, The Shadow in the Hallway expanded. A few days after Sarah's unsettling experience with the whispers, things in the house began to get even stranger. It was a late afternoon when the first real sign of something not quite right appeared. Sarah had just finished her homework and was walking down the long, narrow hallway that connected the bedrooms. The house was unusually quiet, and the usual sounds of her family moving around the house had faded into silence. As Sarah walked past the first bedroom, she felt a chill run through her body. It wasn't the cold, drafty air from the old windows, it was something else, something that made her feel uneasy. She paused for a moment, glancing over her shoulder toward the stairs. There was no sound, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Suddenly, she saw it. At the far end of the hallway, near the staircase, something moved. It was quick, almost like a shadow, but it wasn't just the shape of the shadow that made Sarah's heart race, it was the feeling that something was there, something watching her. The shadow seemed to shift in the corner of her eye, and Sarah quickly turned her head to focus on it, but it was already gone. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she stood frozen. Was it just her imagination? Or had she actually seen something? She walked cautiously to the end of the hallway, trying to convince herself that it was nothing, maybe just a trick of the light. But when she reached the staircase, she felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. There was an odd, oppressive silence in the air. The feeling of being watched only grew stronger, as though the house itself was alive, waiting. Sarah quickly turned away and rushed back to her room. Her heart was beating fast, and she couldn't shake the image of the shadow. Had it been a person? Or had it been something else? Sarah wasn't sure, but whatever it was, it felt wrong. That night, as Sarah tried to fall asleep, she couldn't stop thinking about what she had seen. She told herself it had been her mind playing tricks, but a part of her wasn't convinced. The house had been old and mysterious when they moved in, but now, it felt even more so. Something in the house was watching, and Sarah didn't know if she could trust her own eyes anymore. She wanted to talk to her parents about it, but she didn't want them to think she was being silly. After all, the house was just old, right? But deep down, Sarah knew that something in that house wasn't normal, and it was getting harder and harder to ignore. Part 4, The Unseen Presence expanded. As the days went by, Sarah couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease in the house. The strange occurrences were no longer isolated incidents, they were happening more frequently. Objects seemed to move on their own, and every time Sarah tried to ignore it, something else would happen that made her question if the house was truly haunted. One morning, Sarah's mom was in the kitchen, making breakfast, when she heard a loud crash from the living room. Rushing in, she found the vase that had been sitting on the coffee table lying on the floor, shattered into pieces. The strange thing was, no one had been near it. Sarah, who was reading a book on the couch, looked up in surprise. "I didn't touch it," she said, feeling a chill run through her. Her mom, who was just as confused, said, "It must have fallen by itself." That same evening, Sarah was sitting in her room, trying to focus on her homework. The door was slightly open, and she could hear the sound of her little brother, Tom, playing with his toys in the hallway. But then, she heard something that made her freeze. Soft, slow footsteps came from the direction of Tom's room. At first, she thought it was him walking toward her, but when she looked out into the hallway, Tom was sitting in his room, completely still, playing with his action figures. The footsteps continued. Sarah's heart raced as she looked down the hall, but there was no one there. The air around her felt heavy, almost suffocating. She could hear faint breathing, but no one was near her. Terrified, she quickly closed her bedroom door, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. Later that night, Tom came running into Sarah's room, his eyes wide with fear. "There's a woman in my room," he said, his voice trembling. "She was standing by my bed." Sarah felt a knot form in her stomach. She tried to comfort him, telling him it was probably just a bad dream, but Tom insisted. I saw her. She was wearing a white dress. Sarah didn't know what to think. She hadn't told Tom about the strange things that had been happening in the house, yet he had seen something she hadn't. The thought that something, or someone, was in the house was starting to feel all too real. That night, as Sarah lay in bed, the whispers returned. But this time, they were louder. They seemed to come from everywhere, echoing through the walls, the floor, and the ceiling. Sarah pulled the covers over her head, trying to block it out. But deep down, she knew the house was no longer just old, it was alive with something dark and dangerous. And whatever it wasn't going away. Part 5, The Secret in the Basement expanded. The strange occurrences in the house were no longer something Sarah could ignore. After the unsettling events with the whispers, shadows, and Tom's frightening encounter, she began to feel as though something was truly wrong. But despite her growing fear, Sarah couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was more to the house than she understood. It was as if the house was trying to tell her something, but the pieces of the puzzle weren't fitting together. One afternoon, Sarah was in the kitchen, helping her mom organize some things when she noticed an old door leading to the basement. She had never really paid attention to it before. It was small, hidden behind a stack of boxes and bags, but something about it felt important. She felt drawn to it, as if the house was whispering for her to open it. Her mom had always told her not to go down there alone, saying the basement was full of old, forgotten junk. Sarah had always obeyed, not wanting to explore a place that seemed dark and unwelcoming. But today, the feeling was different. The house had been quiet, almost too quiet, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that there was something in the basement she needed to find. With a deep breath, Sarah grabbed the handle and opened the door. The stairs leading down were steep and narrow, and a cold, musty air greeted her as she stepped inside. She hesitated for a moment, but her curiosity pushed her forward. The basement was dimly lit by a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. As Sarah walked deeper into the basement, she noticed old furniture, dusty boxes, and forgotten items piled up in every corner. It looked like no one had touched anything down there for years. Then, something caught her eye. On the floor, half hidden under a pile of old newspapers, was a small, leather-bound book. It looked ancient, like it belonged to another time. Sarah felt a strange pull toward it, and when she picked it up, she noticed it was heavier than she expected. The cover was decorated with strange symbols she didn't recognize. She opened it cautiously, flipping through the pages. The words inside were handwritten, faded with age, but she could make out bits and pieces. It was a journal, written by someone who had lived in the house long ago. The further she read, the more unsettled she became. The journal described strange events similar to what Sarah had been experiencing. The whispers, the shadows, the cold spots, it was all written down, as if the previous owner had gone through the same things. But there was something darker in the pages too, mentions of a woman who had lived in the house and died under mysterious circumstances. According to the journal, her death was not an accident, it was something far more sinister. The words on the pages seemed to suggest that her spirit never left the house, and it was searching for something. Sarah's hand trembled as she closed the book, her heart racing. She now knew that whatever was haunting the house was not just a random occurrence, it was tied to the house's past, and the spirit of that woman was still very much present. The basement suddenly felt much colder, and Sarah quickly ran back up the stairs, slamming the door behind her. The house was no longer just an old home, it was a place full of dark secrets, and Sarah knew she had uncovered only the beginning. Part 6, The Final Confrontation expanded. After discovering the journal in the basement, Sarah was more frightened than ever. The journal's details about the woman's tragic death and the strange events in the house had shaken her to the core. She couldn't ignore it anymore, the house was definitely haunted, and the spirit of the woman was still there, restless and searching for something. The whispers, the shadows, the cold spots, they weren't just her imagination. Something dark and powerful was connected to this house, and it wanted her to know. Sarah decided she could no longer stay quiet. That night, after dinner, she gathered her family in the living room, her hands trembling as she held the journal. Her heart raced as she explained everything she had found, the strange noises, the shadows, Tom's encounter, and the journal's unsettling details. Her parents listened, their faces full of concern, but they didn't seem to believe her. "It's just an old house, Sarah," her dad said. "Old houses make strange sounds." But Sarah knew this wasn't just an old house. She could feel it, the weight of something watching her, following her every move. Her mom, trying to stay calm, suggested they all go to bed and get some rest, thinking that Sarah might be overthinking things. But Sarah wasn't convinced. She knew something had to be done. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Sarah couldn't sleep. The house was eerily quiet again, but the silence felt heavy, suffocating. She lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to push away the fear that had taken over her. But then, she heard it again, the whispering. This time, it was louder and clearer than before. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere, surrounding her, growing louder and louder. They were no longer soft and distant, they were demanding, almost angry. In the darkness, Sarah heard a voice, clear and cold, "Leave now." The voice sent a chill down her spine. The temperature in her room dropped, and she could see her breath in the air. The shadows in the corners of her room seemed to stretch and twist, moving like they were alive. Sarah's heart raced as she realized the woman's spirit wasn't just trying to scare them, she wanted them to leave, to never come back. With a pounding heart, Sarah grabbed her phone and called her parents. They rushed into her room, but by the time they arrived, the room was silent again. The air felt heavy, but everything else was still. Her mom tried to comfort her, but it was clear from the way she looked at Sarah that she was beginning to believe something was wrong. The next morning, Sarah's family made the decision to leave the house. They couldn't ignore the signs anymore. The spirit of the woman was too powerful, and it was clear that staying any longer would only bring more danger. As they packed their things, the house felt alive, as if it didn't want them to go. The whispering continued, growing fainter with each step they took toward the door, but Sarah knew the house would never truly let them forget. As they left the house for good, Sarah glanced back one last time. The tall, dark window stared back at her, empty and cold. The house stood there, silent once again, but Sarah knew its dark secrets would remain hidden inside, waiting for the next family to move in.